you became pregnant. What was your reaction when you learnt that the child was a boy?
Enormous relief. I felt the whole country was in labour with me. And enormous relief, but I had actually known William was going to be a boy because the scan had shown it, so it was no surprise.
Had you always wanted to have a family?
Yes, I came from a family where there were 4 of us, so we had enormous fun there. And then William and Harry arrived. Fortunately, 2 boys.
The result was already on the screen when the family tree stopped making sense. A rare mitochondrial DNA signature had appeared in the maternal line connected to Princess Diana. The genetic trail did not point neatly toward the European ancestry generations of family records seemed to suggest. Instead, it pointed toward the Indian subcontinent, toward a woman whose name had been buried deep in 19th century history. Her name was Eliza Kewark, and the discovery did not come from testing Princess Diana herself. Researchers reconstructed the maternal line through living relatives and found a rare mitochondrial signature that had been reported predominantly among people from India and Nepal. The finding was announced in 2013, and it raised an uncomfortable question about the ancestry behind one of Britain's most famous royal families. For years, the story of Diana's maternal ancestry appeared to belong entirely to the world of British aristocracy. There were titles, estates, royal connections, and carefully preserved family names. Then genetic evidence opened a door into a much older story, one that led away from Britain's country houses and toward India. And once that door opened, the name Francis Shand Kydd became impossible to overlook. Hi viewers, if this were your own family and you discovered that an important part of your ancestry had been misunderstood for generations, would you want the truth? Comment yes if the truth would matter to you, and if stories about hidden family history deserve to be remembered instead of quietly disappearing. Subscribe, share this story, and leave a like. Silence lets forgotten stories stay forgotten. Tatler.
What do you say, Ma'am, when you read in the papers that you are a determined, domineering woman?
I don't always read that. People very willing to tell me that. But I don't think I am. I'm a perfectionist with myself, but not necessarily with everybody else. Because there's far too much about me in the newspapers, far too much. It horrifies me when there's something more important, like what goes on in a hospice, or there's been a bomb or something. They'll put me on the front page.
The extraordinary part was not simply that Diana's family had a connection to India. Royal and aristocratic families have always contained complicated branches, unexpected relationships, and forgotten ancestors. The extraordinary part was the route taken by this particular ancestry. It traveled through mothers. One woman gave it to her daughter. That daughter gave it to hers. Then another mother, then another. Generation after generation, the same maternal genetic line continued quietly through families that increasingly belonged to British high society. Eventually, that line reached Frances Ruth Roche, the woman the world would later know as Francis Shand Kydd, Diana's mother. And from Frances, the line reached Diana. That connection is what makes the discovery so unsettling. It was not a vague family rumor about some distant ancestor. The investigation focused on mitochondrial DNA, a form of genetic material passed through the maternal line. Because mitochondrial DNA follows that particular route, researchers could use it as a kind of biological thread running backward through generations. The thread led toward a woman named Eliza Kewark, and that was where the story became much stranger. The woman at the beginning of this trail was not a queen. She was not a duchess. She did not live inside a palace or leave behind volumes of carefully preserved memoirs. She lived in India during the early 19th century, when British power was expanding across the subcontinent, and the East India Company dominated enormous parts of political and commercial life. Her connection to the future royal family was almost impossible to imagine. Yet more than a century later, her maternal descendants would include Francis Shand Kydd, then Diana, then Diana's sons. The genetic discovery therefore created a collision between two very different versions of family history. One was the polished genealogy preserved in names, marriages, and social records. The other was written into biology, and biology had suddenly produced a clue that historians could not simply dismiss. The researchers associated with the 2013 investigation
Things became so difficult that you actually tried to injure yourself. Is that true?
When no one listens to you, or you feel no one's listening to you, all sorts of things start to happen. For instance, you have so much pain inside yourself that you try and hurt yourself on the outside because you want help, but it's the wrong help you're asking for. People see it as crying wolf or attention seeking, and they think because you're in the media all the time, you've got enough attention, inverted commas. But I was actually crying out because I wanted to get better.
reported finding a rare mitochondrial haplogroup known as R30b. Their comparison identified only a very small number of examples in the database they examined, with most associated with India and another associated with Nepal. The researchers argued that the results supported an Indian maternal connection reaching back through Diana's family. That did not mean every detail of the family's history had suddenly been solved. It did not prove every rumor that later appeared in newspapers or online. And it certainly did not prove that someone had personally ordered an elaborate destruction of evidence. But it did something more dangerous to a neat family story. It created a question. Why did the genetic evidence point toward an Indian maternal connection when historical descriptions had long associated Eliza Kewark with an Armenian background? That question is where the mystery truly begins. Because names can change, records can be incomplete, people can misunderstand their own ancestry, and sometimes an assumption repeated for generations becomes so familiar that nobody thinks to challenge it. The surviving historical clues surrounding Eliza Kewark are complicated. Her name has been linked to Armenian origins, and historical evidence has contributed to the belief that she had Armenian connections. Yet the genetic evidence from her maternal descendants suggested that her direct maternal ancestry was Indian. Contemporary reports described her as potentially having mixed ancestry rather than providing a simple answer to her identity. That distinction matters, because the most gripping version of this story is not that scientists uncovered a perfectly documented royal conspiracy. The real mystery is more unsettling. It is what happens when the written version of a family and the biological version of that family stop telling the same story. For Diana, that contradiction reached backward through her mother. Frances Shand Kydd had been born Frances Ruth Roche in 1936. Her father was Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy. Her mother was Ruth Sylvia Gill, later known as Baroness Fermoy, who became closely connected to the British royal household. Frances herself would marry John Spencer in 1954 and become the mother of 5 children, including Diana. Nothing about that surface history prepares the viewer for the genetic trail beneath it.
Can't mimic voices for love or money. I'm completely hopeless at it. I was a really bad actor at school, and I've never been able to master the art of mimicry. But my husband, he does it really. He can do all the voices.
Frances belonged to the same world that later surrounded Diana: country houses, aristocratic families, royal acquaintances, social expectations, carefully recorded marriages and births. But DNA does not care about titles. It does not care about social position. It does not care which version of an ancestor sounds more respectable. It follows inheritance, and that inheritance had survived for nearly 2 centuries. When Diana was born on July 1, 1961, she entered the world as the daughter of John Spencer and Frances Shand Kydd. At that moment, nobody looking at the infant girl could have known that decades later, genetic researchers would trace a rare maternal signature through her family and back toward a woman who had lived in India. The royal family, Diana, would eventually become one of the most recognizable women on earth. Her wedding would be watched by hundreds of millions. Her photographs would appear everywhere. Her life would be examined from almost every possible angle. Yet one of the most unusual details about her family history remained hidden in a branch that had nothing to do with royal titles. It was hidden in the women. Frances received the mitochondrial lineage from her mother. Diana received it from Frances. Diana's sons inherited their mitochondrial DNA from Diana. And somewhere much further back stood Eliza Kewark. That meant the story could not be reduced to a rumor about Princess Diana having an unusual ancestor.
Or you became pregnant. What was your reaction when you learned that the child was a boy?
Enormous relief. I felt the whole country was in labour with me. And enormous relief, but I had actually known William was going to be a boy because the scan had shown it, so of course no surprise.
Had you always wanted to have a family?
Yes, I came from a family where there were 4 of us, so we had enormous fun there. And then William and Harry arrived. Fortunately, 2 boys.
The maternal line itself was the evidence. The strange part was that the further researchers followed it, the further the story moved from the familiar world of British aristocracy. The trail led backward, from Diana to Frances, from Frances to her mother, then further, and eventually toward India. That is when a simple ancestry question becomes something much larger. Because if the DNA was telling the truth, then a woman whose life had once existed far outside the British aristocratic world had left behind something that no title, no marriage certificate, and no family description could completely erase. Her name had survived, her bloodline had survived, and the most powerful clue was sitting inside the descendants of the woman who would become Princess Diana's mother. The question was no longer whether the connection existed. The researchers believed the genetic evidence supported it. The question was what had happened to the story along the way. Who was Eliza Kewark before she became a name in a modern DNA investigation? Why did later accounts describe her ancestry differently? What happened to her daughter? And how did that maternal line travel from 19th century India into the heart of Britain's aristocracy? Those questions would lead into a story involving separation, social status, colonial India, and a family line that survived precisely because mothers passed it from one generation to the next. But before that story could reach Diana, it had to begin with a woman almost completely absent from the spotlight. A woman who lived thousands of miles from the royal world. A woman whose daughter would leave India, and a woman whose genetic legacy would eventually reach one of the most famous royal families in modern history. Her name was Eliza Kewark. And the strangest part was that the world would remember the DNA long before it remembered the woman. The child was leaving India, and the woman who had given birth to her was being left behind. There was no palace ceremony, no royal carriage, no crowd waiting to witness the moment. There was simply a mother, a daughter, and a separation that would eventually become one of the strangest chapters in Princess Diana's maternal ancestry. The little girl was Catherine Scott Forbes. Her mother was Eliza Kewark, and somewhere in that separation was the beginning of a genetic trail that would travel through generations of women before reaching Frances Shand Kydd, then Diana, and eventually Diana's sons. The tragedy is that the further the family climbed into British society, the less visible Eliza became. In the surviving historical record, Eliza's identity is complicated. Her name appears in connection with Armenian heritage, while genetic evidence from her maternal descendants later pointed toward Indian ancestry. That contradiction is important because it leaves behind a question that cannot be answered simply by looking at a family tree. What happened to Eliza's story? And why did the woman at the beginning of this maternal line become so difficult to see? The answer begins in Surat, Gujarat, in the early 19th century. Surat was not some isolated corner of India. It was a major trading center connected to merchants, travelers, European companies and communities that had been moving through the region for generations. British commercial power was expanding, and the East India Company had become an enormous force in Indian life. Into that world came Theodore Forbes, a Scottish man born in 1788. He was not the heir to a great fortune. As the third son of his family, he had limited prospects waiting for him at home. India offered another possibility. Men like Forbes could travel thousands of miles, enter commercial service, build careers, and seek wealth far from the estates and expectations of Britain. And in India, Forbes encountered Eliza Kewark. Exactly what Eliza's life looked like before that relationship is much harder to establish. She left behind no famous diary describing her ambitions. No collection of intimate letters gives historians a complete portrait of her personality. Even her ancestry became tangled in competing descriptions. But one thing became increasingly important. Eliza and Forbes had children. One of them was Catherine Scott Forbes, born in 1812. Another, Alexander, followed in 1814. Those births created the maternal line that would eventually reach Diana. But the family did not remain together. Forbes eventually returned to Britain, and Catherine was taken with him. Eliza was left in India. That single decision changed the direction of the family forever. A child who had been born in India would grow up in Britain. A mother who had given birth to her would remain behind. The two worlds would separate, and the daughter would become part of a society increasingly distant from the woman who had brought her into it. The surviving evidence does not tell every detail of that departure. It cannot provide a perfect transcript of what Eliza felt, what Catherine understood, or what was said between them. That silence is precisely what makes the story so haunting, because later generations inherited the consequences without necessarily inheriting the full story. Catherine grew up in Britain, and eventually became part of the social world that would carry her descendants toward the aristocracy. Meanwhile, Eliza's place in the family narrative became increasingly obscure. There is another uncomfortable detail. Historical descriptions associated with Forbes referred to Eliza in a manner that reduced her role in his life, rather than presenting her as a wife. Some accounts described her as his housekeeper. That language matters because it reflects the social reality surrounding relationships between European men and Indian women during the period. Not every relationship was a formal marriage. Not every child entered the world under circumstances that Victorian society would later consider respectable. And not every mother received recognition equal to the father of her children. The British presence in India created thousands of complicated relationships across lines of nationality, race, religion, and class. Some were affectionate, some were exploitative. Many left behind incomplete records. For women like Eliza, the imbalance of power could determine what survived on paper and what disappeared. Her daughter, however, carried something that paper could not easily erase: the maternal genetic line. Catherine eventually had descendants of her own. Those descendants continued through mothers, daughters, and marriages, gradually moving deeper into British society. The transformation was extraordinary. A woman connected to India at the beginning of the 19th century would eventually have descendants connected to British aristocracy, royal circles, and one of the most famous women of the 20th century. But the journey was not obvious. Every generation added another layer, another surname, another marriage, another social position, and with every generation, Eliza became more distant. This is where the story begins to resemble a disappearing photograph. The people in the foreground remain visible. The person standing farthest behind becomes harder to identify. Yet the genetic signature remained. It passed from mother to daughter. That distinction is crucial. Mitochondrial DNA follows a very specific inheritance route. A mother passes her mitochondrial DNA to her children, but only her daughters continue passing that mitochondrial line forward. That means the maternal chain leading from Eliza had to remain intact through successive generations of women. One break in that female line would have ended the trail, but it did not break. It continued. Catherine's descendants eventually included Ruth Sylvia Gill. Ruth became an important bridge between the obscure 19th century story and the 20th century aristocratic world. She married Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy. Their daughter was Frances Ruth Roche, and suddenly the story moved much closer to Diana. Frances was born into privilege and became part of Britain's upper social circles. She married John Spencer in 1954, joining the Spencer family and becoming the mother of 5 children. Her daughter Diana was born in 1961. At that point, almost everything about the family looked completely different from the world Eliza had known. The Indian connection was no longer visible in everyday life. The family had moved through generations of British society. The names had changed, the surroundings had changed, the social position had changed. But the maternal genetic thread remained, and that is where the title surrounding Diana's mother's ancestry becomes far more interesting than a simple royal scandal. The strange discovery was not that someone suddenly found an Indian ancestor in a massive family tree. It was that genetic evidence offered a route to an ancestor whose identity had become disputed, while the descendant carrying that line was the mother of Princess Diana. The woman at the center of that discovery was Frances Shand Kydd. Frances could not have known that researchers decades later would examine the maternal line behind her. She could not have known that a rare mitochondrial signature would send investigators backward through her mother, her grandmother, and earlier generations. And Eliza could never have imagined any of it. She lived before photography became a part of ordinary life, before modern genetic testing, before computers could compare distant populations in seconds, before anyone could take a tiny biological inheritance and use it to challenge assumptions about a family tree. Yet that inheritance survived. It survived through daughters. It crossed oceans. It crossed centuries. And eventually it entered one of the most photographed families on Earth. There is something almost cruel about that contrast. Eliza's life became obscure, while Diana's became impossible to escape. Millions knew Diana's face. Almost nobody knew Eliza's name. Millions watched Diana's wedding. Almost nobody knew that generations earlier, a maternal branch connected to India had entered the ancestry of the woman standing at the center of Britain's royal story. And now the question becomes even sharper. If Eliza's maternal ancestry was Indian, how did the family come to associate her with an Armenian background? Was it a deliberate attempt to hide something? Was it a misunderstanding that became accepted as fact? Or was the truth simply more complicated than the surviving records could explain? Those possibilities must be separated carefully. The DNA evidence can provide a genetic clue. It cannot read the minds of people who lived 200 years ago. It cannot prove why a particular description entered a family history. It cannot tell historians whether a decision was motivated by shame, convenience, uncertainty, prejudice, or simple confusion. But it can reveal something powerful. The story written in documents is not always the whole story written in blood, and somewhere between those two versions stood Eliza Kewark. Her daughter left India. Her descendants entered British society. Her maternal line reached Frances Shand Kydd, then Diana, and eventually, through Diana, the genetic legacy reached the modern royal family. The woman who seemed to disappear had never truly disappeared. She had been traveling quietly through every generation, and the next question was the one researchers could no longer avoid. What exactly did that DNA reveal about the woman the family tree had struggled to describe? The photograph could have shown an ordinary aristocratic family gathering. Instead, it concealed a maternal trail that would eventually connect India to Princess Diana. Behind Frances Shand Kydd's polished family history was a line of women carrying something no portrait could reveal, a rare genetic signature through generations unnoticed. Frances Shand Kydd did not spend her life wondering whether her ancestry contained a mystery. She belonged to an aristocratic world where family connections were recorded carefully, marriages announced, titles preserved, and pedigrees discussed. Yet the most revealing branch of her maternal history was almost invisible to everyone around her. That branch began with Ruth Sylvia Gill, Frances's mother, and moved backward through women whose names became increasingly distant from Eliza. Each generation changed the family's surroundings, but the maternal inheritance remained. The remarkable thing was not a title or marriage. It was what traveled silently between mothers and daughters. By the time Frances was born in 1936, the world that had shaped Eliza was almost impossible to recognize. Frances entered British aristocratic life through her parents, Maurice Roche and Ruth. Her mother's family carried connections to royalty, while Frances herself would later become Diana's mother and a public figure. The independent, but ancestry is not always visible in the lives people lead. Frances could attend Westminster Abbey, live among aristocrats, and raise children connected to the Spencer family without any obvious sign that one branch reached back to India. The mystery remained buried inside inheritance, waiting for another generation to expose it. That generation arrived with Diana. Born in 1961, she grew up surrounded by the privileges and pressures of Britain's aristocracy. Her family history was filled with names that mattered in royal circles. Yet none of those names could explain why her maternal DNA would later point towards South Asia again. That discovery would also expose something important about the nature of family history. A pedigree can show names. It cannot always explain why a name appears, who was forgotten, or which assumptions were repeated until they became accepted truth. DNA could not answer every question, but it could force old questions back into view with uncomfortable clarity for another generation to confront them. The next step was not a royal announcement. It was genealogy. Researchers needed to establish whether the maternal chain connecting Eliza to Francis could actually be followed through documented generations. That meant finding living people who descended from the same female line and whose DNA could provide an independent comparison. The Independent. They found 2 living direct descendants of Eliza Kewark, who were third cousins of Francis Shand Kydd. Their saliva samples provided the material for the mitochondrial analysis. The testing did not involve secretly collecting DNA from Diana or William. That distinction mattered because the story was often simplified after publication. What those samples revealed was the beginning of the real shock. The 2 relatives shared the same mitochondrial lineage. Researchers identified it as R30b, a rare haplogroup that, in the database examined, appeared predominantly in South Asian samples. The results strengthened the argument that Eliza's maternal ancestry was Indian in origin, but the result was striking. But it was not the same as proving that every part of Eliza's ancestry was Indian. Her paternal background could have involved Armenian ancestry, as some historical clues suggested. The genetic evidence concerned the maternal line. That distinction would become essential as the story grew louder. Then came the second layer of evidence. Researchers also examined hundreds of thousands of genetic markers across the genomes of the 2 living descendants. Their results included small amounts of South Asian ancestry, reported as 0.3% and 0.8%. It was a clue, not proof. Together, the findings made the maternal connection harder to ignore, yet serious questions remained. The prince himself had not provided the DNA sample used to establish the haplogroup. The researchers inferred his maternal lineage through genealogy and testing of relatives. That difference was frequently lost when headlines reduced the story. The headlines turned a complicated genealogical finding into something far more dramatic. Suddenly, newspapers were discussing an Indian connection to the future king. But beneath the excitement was a quieter revelation. The ancestry had survived through an unbroken chain of mothers, and Francis sat near the end of that chain. That was the point where Francis's place in the story became extraordinary. She was not merely Diana's mother in a celebrity narrative. She was a living genealogical bridge between the aristocratic 20th century and a woman who had lived in India more than a century earlier. Her ancestry connected them. Frances herself had a complicated life long before the DNA story emerged. She married John Spencer in 1954, when she was only 18. Their family lived close to the royal world, including Park House on the Sandringham estate. Their daughter Diana arrived in 1961, carrying the same maternal thread forward. The family story would soon become famous for reasons unrelated to genealogy. Diana grew into the woman whose image dominated newspapers, magazines, and television. Yet the maternal ancestry behind her remained largely outside public attention. Even after her marriage to Prince Charles, the hidden branch remained hidden from view entirely. That changed in June 2013, when the genetic findings became public. The announcement did not reveal a secret about Diana herself. Instead, it showed that researchers had reconstructed a maternal line linking her family to Eliza Kewark. The story suddenly moved from old genealogy into modern science and global headlines. The Independent. For the first time, the strange ancestry was being discussed openly alongside Diana's name. Newspapers described the discovery as evidence that the future king carried Indian ancestry, yet the actual investigation was more subtle. It concerned a maternal ancestor and the descendants who carried her lineage forward through time quietly. The Independent. At this point, a choice faces every viewer. Treat this as another royal curiosity or help keep a forgotten woman visible. If Eliza deserves more than a footnote, a like, a share, and a subscription become a refusal to let family stories decide whose history gets remembered and whose gets buried. Ancestry is not a single word. It can describe culture, birthplace, family identity, or genetic inheritance. Those things can overlap, but they are not identical. Eliza could have had Armenian connections and Indian maternal ancestry at the same time. The DNA finding did not erase complexity. It exposed it instead, and that complexity became especially important because Eliza's surname and historical correspondence had helped shape the story of her identity. Some records suggested Armenian connections, while the genetic evidence pointed toward Indian maternal ancestry. Those facts could coexist. A person can carry multiple cultural inheritances without fitting neatly inside one modern label. The mystery deepened. Then came the question of what happened after Catherine left India. Her descendants did not remain in the same place or social position. They moved through Britain, married into established families, and eventually entered aristocratic circles. The maternal line kept moving, while Eliza's own life became increasingly difficult to reconstruct. Catherine later married James Crombie in Aberdeen. Her daughter Jane followed, then Ruth Littlejohn, then Ruth Gill. Each generation brought another British surname and another layer between Diana and the woman in Surat. Yet the genetic thread remained continuous because daughters kept carrying it forward. The line never broke. Until, by the 20th century, the descendants were no longer living within the world Eliza had known. Ruth Gill married Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy. Their daughter Frances entered the aristocratic world that would eventually make Diana one of the most recognizable women alive. The transformation was complete. But the past was exactly what the researchers were about to drag into the light. The maternal sequence had traveled from Eliza to Catherine, then through Jane, Ruth, and Frances, finally reaching Diana. The chain was not a rumor created after Diana's death. It was a genealogical route reconstructed from records. Then the biological evidence gave that route a second foundation. The two living descendants carried matching R30b mitochondrial DNA. Their shared sequence was rare in the comparison database, with reported examples concentrated in South Asia. That did not turn Eliza into a simple label. It made her maternal ancestry remarkable. University College London. And this was where the story became uncomfortable for anyone who wanted ancestry to remain neat. The older description of Eliza as Armenian could not simply be treated as a complete answer. Yet the genetic findings could not tell historians exactly why that description survived. The gap remained, wide open. That gap is what would lead to the next revelation. Because once the maternal line reached Frances and Diana, the question changed. It was no longer simply where Eliza came from. It was how a woman with a complicated identity became part of a family whose story had been preserved. Chapter 4 begins where the family tree met the laboratory, and suddenly the past had nowhere left to hide. The result did not come from Princess Diana's private medical records. Researchers had instead examined DNA from two living relatives connected through her direct maternal line. Their genealogy traced backward through generations of women toward Eliza Kewark, the woman at the center of the mystery. Their samples matched. Then came the detail that transformed an obscure family connection into a global royal story. The mitochondrial DNA belonged to a rare lineage called R30b. According to the researchers, only 14 examples had been identified in their comparison database, 13 associated with India and 1 with Nepal. That number was tiny, but the number alone was not the real shock. The important part was the inheritance pattern. Mitochondrial DNA passes from a mother to her children, while only daughters continue passing that mitochondrial line to the next generation. That meant the researchers were not simply looking at a random piece of genetic material floating somewhere inside the family. They were following a narrow biological road. Eliza Kewark stood at one end. Princess Diana stood much closer to the other. And between them were generations of women who had carried the same maternal signature forward, without knowing that, one day, scientists would use it to reconstruct their ancestry. The genealogy connected Eliza to Catherine Scott Forbes, born in Surat in 1812. From Catherine came Jane Crombie, then Ruth Littlejohn, then Ruth Gill, then Frances Roche, Diana's mother, then Diana herself. The chain was remarkable because every link depended upon a mother passing her mitochondrial inheritance to her children, and a daughter continuing that inheritance onward. By the 20th century, the family had moved deeply into British aristocratic society. Yet the genetic thread still pointed backward toward India. It was a reminder that family identity can change dramatically across generations, while biological inheritance continues silently beneath the surface. Frances Shand Kydd therefore occupied a remarkable position in this story. She was not merely Diana's mother. Genetically, according to the reconstruction presented by the researchers, she was one of the final visible links between the aristocratic family of the 20th century and Eliza Kewark's 19th century maternal line. Frances was born Frances Ruth Roche in 1936. She married John Spencer in 1954, and their daughter Diana was born 7 years later. By then, the world surrounding Frances looked nothing like the world Eliza had known. The names had changed, the homes had changed, the social position had changed, but the maternal line remained. The independent. That is where the story becomes uncomfortable. A family can preserve photographs, titles, marriage certificates, and carefully assembled genealogies, yet still lose sight of one person buried several generations deep. Eliza's identity had already become complicated in historical records. She was commonly described as Armenian, with her surname resembling the Armenian name Kewark, and surviving correspondence containing Armenian script. Those details gave researchers reasons to consider Armenian cultural or paternal connections. But the genetic evidence presented in 2013 pointed toward Indian ancestry through her mother line. Those two possibilities were not necessarily mutually exclusive. Eliza could have had Armenian connections through one side of her family and Indian ancestry through another. And that distinction is critical because the DNA did not answer every question. It did not reveal Eliza's complete ancestry. It did not prove that every historical description of her was false. Most importantly, it did not prove that members of Diana's family had deliberately destroyed records. That idea became part of the wider speculation surrounding the story, but the genetic evidence itself could not establish motive. It could show inheritance, it could support a maternal connection, it could reveal a genetic signature associated with populations where that lineage was observed. It could not reach into the minds of people who lived 2 centuries earlier. That unanswered space became part of the mystery. Still, the researchers considered the evidence significant. Their comparison involved more than 65,000 individuals, and only 14 examples of R30B had been reported in their database at the time. 13 were Indian, and 1 was Nepalese. The researchers also noted that related branches were South Asian. They therefore concluded that Eliza's mitochondrial DNA was of Indian heritage. The finding was striking because it gave biological weight to a maternal connection that had not been obvious in the family's traditional story. But then another layer appeared. Researchers did not stop with mitochondrial DNA. They also examined more than 700,000 autosomal markers across the genomes of the 2 living matrilineal relatives. Their estimates placed their South Asian ancestry at roughly 0.3% and 0.8%. That amount was tiny, exactly what would be expected from an ancestor living many generations earlier. Yet both relatives reportedly contained blocks of South Asian DNA, giving researchers another piece of evidence to consider alongside the genealogy and mitochondrial findings. That second result mattered because mitochondrial DNA represents only one narrow maternal line. It does not describe an entire person's ancestry. Someone can inherit a mitochondrial lineage from one distant maternal ancestor while inheriting most of their other DNA from completely different ancestral populations. This is why the discovery did not mean that Princess Diana was secretly anything other than what her broader family history showed. It meant something much more precise. One branch of her maternal ancestry reached back toward India, and that branch could be followed through documented generations of women. Then came the headline that made the story explode. Prince William carries the mitochondrial lineage associated with Eliza Kewark because the line runs through his mother, Diana. Prince Harry also inherited the same mitochondrial markers. But neither son can pass that mitochondrial lineage to his children, because mitochondrial DNA is transmitted through mothers. That detail created a strange boundary in the family tree. William and Harry carried the genetic signature, but their children would not inherit that particular mitochondrial line from them. Suddenly, an obscure woman from 19th century Surat was being discussed alongside the future King of Britain. Newspapers described William as having Indian ancestry. Some reports calculated that the connection represented approximately 1/256th of his ancestry. The number was small, but the story was enormous. It was not the size of the percentage that mattered. It was the fact that a genetic trail could connect the future British monarch to a woman whose life had unfolded in colonial India more than a century before his birth. The Independent. And that was the moment the story stopped being merely about Diana's family. It became a story about what happens when DNA collides with historical identity. Because the old description of Eliza as Armenian had not appeared from nowhere. There were clues behind it. Her name resembled Kewark. Letters associated with her contained Armenian script. Those details suggested that Armenian culture or ancestry could have been part of her background, yet the researchers argued that her maternal genetic heritage was Indian. The result, therefore, did not produce a simple replacement of one identity with another. It produced a contradiction that demanded a more careful question. How had one part of Eliza's ancestry become so prominent in historical descriptions, while another part remained invisible until genetic testing? That question is where the story becomes dangerous for anyone who prefers neat answers. There are several possible explanations. Historical records may have been incomplete. Family traditions may have simplified a complicated background. Cultural identity may have been passed down differently from biological ancestry. And social attitudes in 19th century British India may have influenced how relationships and children were recorded. The available evidence does not justify declaring one explanation proven, but the uncertainty itself is revealing. For generations, the family tree could carry a name without carrying the full story behind that name. Then science came along and asked a different question. Not, what did the family call her, but what did her descendants inherit? The answer led straight back to R30b. And the deeper researchers went, the harder it became to treat Eliza as an irrelevant footnote. Her genetic signature had survived through generations of women. It had survived changes in geography, marriage, status, and surname. It had crossed from India into Britain. It had passed into the family of Francis Shand Kydd. Then it passed to Diana, and through Diana, it reached William and Harry. The irony was almost impossible to miss. The woman who had been easiest to overlook had left behind one of the hardest things to erase: DNA. That did not prove every rumor surrounding the family. It did not prove a deliberate conspiracy. It did not reveal every secret surrounding Eliza's life. But it did something that old records could not do alone. It forced the forgotten branch of the family tree back into the conversation. And the most unsettling discovery was still waiting. Because once researchers had established the genetic connection, the mystery changed completely. The question was no longer whether Diana's maternal line reached India. The question became what the DNA actually said about Eliza Kewark, what it could not say, and why the story surrounding her identity had remained so complicated for nearly 2 centuries. That was the revelation waiting at the end of the trail, and it would force the entire story to be viewed differently. The strangest part of Princess Diana's maternal ancestry was never the headline about Indian DNA. It was what happened after the DNA had spoken. A genetic result could identify a maternal lineage, but it could not explain why that lineage had become so difficult to recognize in the historical record. It could not explain why Eliza Kewark was remembered through one cultural description while her maternal DNA pointed somewhere else. And it could not tell anyone whether the difference came from prejudice, incomplete records, family tradition, mixed ancestry, or something much simpler. The evidence revealed a mystery. It did not manufacture an answer. That distinction matters because the story became much larger than the original scientific finding. In 2013, reports presented the research as evidence that Prince William had Indian ancestry through his mother, Diana. The researchers had tested 2 living matrilineal relatives rather than William himself, and those relatives shared the rare mitochondrial haplogroup R30b. Their genealogical connection led back to Eliza Kewark. The researchers reported that their comparison database contained only 14 examples of the lineage, 13 associated with India and 1 with Nepal. The finding was extraordinary, but it also required restraint. A mitochondrial haplogroup does not reveal an entire person's ancestry. It follows one maternal branch. That means the discovery did not suddenly transform Diana's entire family background. It identified something much narrower and in some ways much more fascinating. One maternal line running through her family reached back toward India. That line had survived through generations of women, crossed continents, passed through aristocratic marriages, and eventually reached Frances Shand Kydd and her daughter Diana. And then there was the question nobody could answer with DNA alone. Why had Eliza's identity become so complicated? Some historical accounts associated her with Armenian ancestry. Her surname, Kewark, has been connected with the Armenian name Kevork, and surviving correspondence containing Armenian script has been cited as evidence of Armenian connections. Yet the researchers argued that the mitochondrial DNA established Indian maternal heritage. Those details do not automatically contradict one another. A woman can have ancestry from more than one community. She can carry one cultural identity while having another ancestry through her mother. What the evidence did was expose how dangerously simple an old family description could become. The temptation is to turn that contradiction into a conspiracy. That would make the story easier, but it would also make it weaker. There is no genetic test capable of proving that a Victorian relative deliberately ordered records destroyed. There is no DNA sequence that can reveal whether a family member acted from shame, fear, social pressure, or ignorance. Those explanations remain possibilities, not established facts. What can be established is that the genetic evidence and the older description did not fit neatly together, and that the discrepancy deserved investigation. The historical setting makes that discrepancy even more revealing. Eliza lived in British-controlled India at a time when relationships between British men and Indian women were common. Even though later Victorian attitudes toward race and social respectability became increasingly restrictive. Some Anglo-Indian families attempted to minimize or conceal Indian ancestry because social advancement could depend heavily on appearance, status, and acceptance. Historians have documented examples of people suppressing or reshaping parts of their heritage. That wider history provides context for Eliza's story, but it cannot prove exactly what happened inside her particular family. The Guardian. What happened next is the part that makes the story feel almost impossible. Eliza's daughter Catherine left India and was raised in Scotland. Generations later, Catherine's descendants entered British aristocratic society. Ruth Gill married Maurice Roche, 4th Baron Fermoy. Their daughter became Frances Ruth Roche. Frances married John Spencer. Their daughter was Diana. A maternal line that began with a woman living in 19th century India had reached the mother of the woman who would become Princess of Wales. The Guardian. The distance between those lives is enormous. Eliza lived in Surat. Frances belonged to Britain's aristocratic world. Diana became a global icon, and yet the biological thread connecting them remained remarkably simple. Mother to daughter, mother to daughter, mother to daughter. That is what makes mitochondrial DNA so powerful in a story like this. It does not care about the social meaning attached to a surname. It does not care whether an ancestor was rich or poor, celebrated or forgotten. It follows inheritance. Researchers used that inheritance to connect two living descendants and then followed their documented maternal genealogy backward. The result created a bridge between a 19th century woman whose life is poorly documented and one of the most famous families in modern Britain, University College London. There was another remarkable detail. The researchers also examined more than 700,000 autosomal genetic markers from the two living descendants. They reported estimates of approximately 0.3% and 0.8% South Asian ancestry, including blocks of South Asian DNA. That additional evidence supported the idea that the connection was not merely a genealogical story attached to a rare mitochondrial marker. But again, the result needed to be understood carefully. It was evidence about distant ancestry, not a complete ethnic biography of Eliza or Diana. And this is where the title becomes more powerful than a simple claim that Diana's mother had a strange ancestor. The weirdness is not that India appeared somewhere in a British aristocratic family tree. The weirdness is how long the connection remained invisible. For generations, nobody needed to think about it. The family lived their lives. Children were born, women married, surnames changed, estates changed hands. Social circles shifted, the world changed around them. Yet inside every daughter carrying that maternal line, the same genetic inheritance continued. Then modern science arrived. Suddenly, a forgotten woman had become relevant again. Not because a royal biography decided she was interesting. Not because a family member suddenly produced a sensational confession. Because her descendants carried evidence in their cells. That is why Eliza's story reaches beyond Diana. It challenges the assumption that an official family tree is automatically the complete truth. A family tree is assembled from records. Records are created by people. People remember selectively. They misunderstand. They omit. They use labels that make sense in their own time. Sometimes documents disappear naturally. Sometimes families preserve certain details more carefully than others. And sometimes social attitudes influence which parts of a person's identity are emphasized. The DNA cannot tell us which of those possibilities explains Eliza's story, but it can force us to admit that the old version was incomplete. And if that matters, then this is the moment to stop and think about what happens to forgotten people when nobody is willing to look again. A like is easy. A share takes seconds. A subscription costs almost nothing. But when people refuse to engage with stories like this, forgotten names remain forgotten, while polished versions of history continue moving forward untouched. If Eliza's story deserves to be heard, then passing it along is one small way of refusing to let her disappear a second time. There is also an extraordinary irony in what happened to her descendants. Prince William and Prince Harry inherited the mitochondrial markers associated with Eliza through Diana. Yet because mitochondrial DNA passes from mothers to their children, William and Harry cannot pass that particular mitochondrial lineage to their own children. The line continues through daughters. The biology creates a strange boundary in the royal family, one that has nothing to do with titles or succession and everything to do with how human inheritance works. So when the story is reduced to a headline about Prince William having Indian ancestry, something important gets lost. The real story begins much earlier. It begins with a woman in India whose life is only partially visible. It continues with a daughter separated from her mother. It moves through generations of women. It reaches Frances Shand Kydd. It reaches Diana. And eventually it reaches the modern British royal family. The discovery does not prove that every rumor about a hidden royal secret is true. It does something more interesting. It shows that history can contain gaps that science later exposes. It shows that ancestry is rarely as tidy as a family tree makes it look. And it reminds the world that the people who appear least important in old records can sometimes leave behind the evidence that changes everything. Eliza Kewark never knew Princess Diana. She never knew Frances. She never knew that one day millions of people would recognize the face of her descendant. She never knew that scientists would compare DNA from relatives living generations after her death. She never knew that her maternal lineage would become part of a conversation about Britain's royal family. But the inheritance survived. The names changed. The countries changed. The social world changed. The memory faded. The DNA did not. And perhaps that is the strangest answer of all. The secret was never completely erased because it was never entirely written on paper in the first place. It was written into a maternal line. For nearly 200 years, that line moved quietly through women who had no reason to believe anyone would ever follow it backward. Then one day researchers did exactly that. They followed the trail until it reached Eliza. And suddenly, a woman who had been almost invisible became the key to understanding an unexpected piece of Princess Diana's maternal ancestry. That is what makes this story so difficult to forget. Not the royal titles, not the headlines, not even the percentage of Indian ancestry. It is the image of a forgotten woman whose life disappeared from public memory while something far more stubborn continued traveling through her descendants. Her DNA survived the silence. It crossed the ocean. It crossed generations. It entered Britain's aristocracy. It reached Diana. And decades after Diana became a global icon, science followed that invisible thread back to the woman where it began, Eliza Kewark. The historical record may never answer every question about her, It may never tell us exactly why her identity was remembered the way it was. It may never reveal every conversation, every fear, or every decision surrounding her family. But the genetic evidence left behind one undeniable lesson. A family can forget an ancestor. A record can become incomplete. A story can become simplified. But inheritance has a way of remembering. And that is why the strangest thing revealed about Princess Diana's mother's ancestry was not simply that an Indian maternal connection existed. It was that the connection had survived everything that came after it. The woman disappeared. The bloodline remained. And almost 2 centuries later, the DNA brought her name back.